I'm going to go ahead and get started. It looks like we have our panel here. And Anna, thank you for turning it over to me. I will just start with, a few brief statements, and then we'll kick off with the stars of this panel, which I'm sure you'll agree with me are really, really top of the field and diverse in their perspectives. So first, I'd like to say that thinking about where the field has been and where it's going, I would say that recognition of the importance of addressing norms at all levels, from donors to governments to various actors on the ground, has really never been greater. The range of forms of violence and exploitation that are being elucidated and acted upon is also growing in conceptualization and sophistication in programming and evidence of what works. The panelists really represent many of these diverse efforts, along with a range of presentations and panels that you'll see throughout this meeting. The diversity of topics and approaches is emblematic of this dynamic and growing field of research and practice. This meeting has similarly grown to highlight these developments and to be a crucible of networked action. It is my distinct pleasure and honor to be a part of this special meeting. And as I've mentioned before, it is definitely one of my favorites, and I'm so grateful that it has been able to move forward even in this online space, which the team has really curated into as intimate a space as possible. So we will get started, and I will introduce Caroline Harper, who probably needs no introduction, but I will say just a couple of sentences about her. Caroline Harper is an Overseas Development Institute Principal Research Fellow and Program Director in Gender Equality and Social Inclusion. She specializes in gender norms, discrimination, and poverty, and is focused on building a critical and policy relevant knowledge base and empowering researchers and activists with skills, evidence, and capacity to act on findings locally and globally. So Caroline looks like she's ready, so I'm going to temporarily stop my video and mute myself and turn it over to Caroline for her 15 minutes.
Hi, I guess I'm on. I can't actually see my own picture. So
you look perfect.
Okay, great. It's a bit nerve-wracking not being able to see yourself, but anyway, I'll just keep going. Please let me know if anything goes wrong. And hello, everyone. It's a shame that I can't see you all, and I wish I could, but I'm really happy to be here today and giving this talk. So I've been asked to talk today to frame up norms, what they are, how they change, and how fast they change. So it's quite a broad sort of perspective and introduction. So I'm just going to say next slide when I want the next slide, if that's okay. So if you could just change the slide. So I work on gendered norms in particular, but within the framing of social norms. And as you are all very aware, these can be positive and affirmative, or neutral, or harmful and discriminatory. So I'm going to start by describing some different and some common understandings of norms and why this matters, and then look at some progress in norm change over time, which is based on some historical work we've done, and ask actually why is it so hard and so slow, and what is holding us back. So some of this will be familiar to some of you, and so I'm sorry if I'm going over old ground, but hopefully it's some new insights for some people. So as we all know, this meeting is about sexual exploitation. So my first slide references this and the norms that underpin these attitudes and behaviors. Next slide, please. LINEA have done a wonderful job in contextualizing how norms are relevant in this area. And as you can see on this slide, this is about inequalities in power, which underpin this exploitation. And this sort of power is held in place through normalized attitudes about what is expected and appropriate. And for men, as we know, these are some of the expectations, that sexual prowess is a sign of masculinity, and in contrast for women, quite differently, that early marriage might be normal, and that there's much stigma applied to girls, but not to boys and men. And these are some of the attitudes and behaviours which reflect deeper power relations between the genders. It's the patriarchy, which gives men power over women and girls and expects women and girls, and indeed men and boys, to comply. And sometimes neither sex wants to comply, but feel they should. Slide, please. So, next slide. Others will deliberate on these particular norms during the course of the meeting. And I know that I'm speaking to a very informed audience, but I would suspect that we all understand norms, but perhaps a little differently. Next slide. And these are the definitions that I work from. So social norms as the implicit informal rules that most people accept and follow, and gender norms as a subset of social norms, describing how people of a particular gender or age are expected to behave. And remembering that social norms are influenced by multiple different factors in the wider environment, maintained by rewards and sanctions and embedded in institutions, and that gender norms in particular are influenced and intersect with norms related to class, ethnicity, race, sexual orientation, and so on. So social norms can include all sorts of behaviours to me, such as spitting in the street, wearing a seatbelt, but at the other end, they may include attitudes which suggest it's okay to beat children, it's okay to use racial slurs, and it's okay to beat your wife. And these norms obviously differ in nature, largely because of issues of power in the latter set of examples. Next slide, please. I think those of you who were at the last LINEA meeting will have seen this picture before. But our understandings, we see something and our understandings vary because of the way we think. So, very broadly, there's a sociological tradition which emphasizes the role of norms in constituting society, and other interpretations, such as social psychological approaches, focus more on why people comply with social norms. This is a blunt description of how we may think differently. Next slide, please. If Laurie is online, this is something that I believe she put together with Ben Sisley. And it really talks about how, a gender norm approach would probably look at all the institutions of society to understand how they operate, whereas a more social psychology approach would look at the mind and how our beliefs are shaped by our experiences of other people's actions and their approval and disapproval. This then would, the implications of this is that on the one hand, you would look at changing norms by working with the institutions of power, such as legal frameworks or religious institutions. And on the other hand, you might look to change norms to alter people's mindsets, so trying to change the way that they think. In reality, both understandings exist at the same time. There's restrictions in both as to what can be done, as well as opportunities. And over the last few years in particular, I think these approaches have come together. Next slide, please. I just want to look at a few of the data points around norm change before returning to some of the breaks on norm change process. In our studies in the Align program, we looked at norm change over time, undertaking interviews with women going back, in some cases, 60 years in Uganda and Nepal, and more recently looking at data over the past 25 years since Beijing. And we'll be releasing a report on this in November. I obviously don't have time, next slide please, to go into all the learning, but we've got multiple briefs on the history analysis and reports on the Align platform, so please take a look. So first of all, we know that norms change. They change all the time, and in terms of gender norms over the past 100 years, the trend is positive, but 100 years is a long time, so change is very slow. Next slide. And this is not unnoticed. As you all know, the UN Secretary General, 20 years after Beijing, said progress is unacceptably slow. This was also noted in last year in the UN Women's Annual Report. Next slide, please. And if we actually look at some of the figures around change in areas that are very influenced by norms, we can see that there is change. Adolescent childbearing dropped. More in high-income countries than in low-income countries over over this period of time. The number of countries recognising domestic violence actually as a crime has increased hugely, and more now it is a lot more than 76. I believe it's over 120, 30, which is a significant change. Women in ministerial positions has changed, but not very deeply, if only 5% of women around the world are mayors. Next slide. Areas where there's real stagnation, violence statistics remain very high. There has been an increase in contraception use, but it's slowed down recently. The gender gap in labour market participation just doesn't move, hardly at all. So over 20 years, it shifted 2 percentage points. And in South Asia and Eastern Asia, it's actually going backwards. And of course, the care economy continues to be a huge restraint. So we know that if women do not have economic stability, they're vulnerable to exploitation. And if they don't have voice, change won't happen, or it will happen slowly. So these are all interrelated. And for our report that's forthcoming, we looked at 4 areas in particular: jobs, voice, education, and sexual and reproductive health. And there are many specific issues to each area, but there was one notable common factor across all areas, which was slowing progress. And that was violence and control over women's sexuality and morality. And whilst much has changed in both of our country settings, which were Uganda and Nepal, and whilst granddaughters noted their much better education and opportunities compared to grandmothers, control over women's sexuality and violence continues. Next slide, please. And this was what women were saying just 2 years ago or 1 year ago. There's little breakthrough around women's bodies, in attitudes that the way you dress makes you responsible for rape. Everyone is up in arms about women's bodies, restricting what she can or cannot do. Violence is part of the backlash. A man thinks he has a right to slap, but now he fears being reported. It's the fear of the law. And virginity is still a strong social norm. In Nepali cultures, morality and goodness are linked up into sexual activities. So a women's reputation is like water in a yam's leaves. Even a small slip and it will fall off. Slide, please. So this control over women acts as a brake on change. And change itself is chaotic, but it's inevitable. It's a struggle, but it's inevitable. And our researchers noted that there was a real sense of chaos during these change processes in which the leaders, the guardians of the ethnic and religious values, they were struggling in the face of this change as the cultural control and the power of sanctions were being lost. Men in Uganda noted what they called the empty pants syndrome, their power over women and girls ineffectual as girls found economic autonomy. Slide, please. So the presence of both violence and notions of sexual morality and purity in women's lives brings us back to patriarchy. Now, earlier I was talking about the definition of norms and how we understand them as both in the mind and internalized, and also acting through the institutions of society. And these ideas, such as men deserve sex or they're entitled to hit their wives, are norms which reflect men's moral authority and social privilege. And this norm becomes a natural order, such that it is beyond questioning. And I'm going to get a little sociological here. Next slide, please. And so I really like this concept of Doxa. Many of you will recognize this. It captures perfectly the state of one's perception of what's normal. And Bourdieu called it the gradual socialization of people into gendered norms through everyday practice until certain practices are beyond questioning and their outcomes, such as the lack of voice for women in politics or perceptions of who undertakes care work, becomes the norm. And the universality of Doxa is a useful concept to grasp. Next slide, please. So patriarchy, the male grip, particularly on moral authority and social privilege, is still the norm in so many contexts, if not all contexts, that this apparently natural order is almost everyone's Doxa to a greater or lesser degree. And expectations of marriage, motherhood, and so on become natural roles and create worldviews. And these patterns may not always be negative, but when a norm causes harm or discrimination, it needs to change. When women politicians are met with violence, when women are bullied in perceived masculine spaces, such as in the armed forces, It's because they're seen as operating outside the natural order. And all of this creates brakes on social change, which means that women, and we found this in all of our research, are reluctant to enter certain workplaces, and men don't want them to go there. There's fears about the moral influence of schools on girls. There's disdain for women's dress choices, and there's violent control over women's bodies. A moral authority translates into ideas of purity and shame, and these ideas operate as levers of control, keeping women out of the workplace, out of school, and reducing the power of their voice. So patriarchal norms are powerful and persistent, but importantly, they're ultimately a failing brake on social change. And sometimes the brake holds for a little while, but eventually, and in most contexts, it gives way, and it allows a little but very slow movement forward. Next slide, please. And fortunately, we also interviewed a lot of women who express views like this. I think it's crap because you can't put a price on someone when you get down to it. And this was part of the cultural unraveling of a norm that was giving way. Next slide, please. I think I'm running very close to the end, so I was just going to talk a little bit about the fact that change is chaotic. It's not all at the same pace, and there's very important interrelated factors. Obviously, you don't have to work on norms to change norms, but it's advantageous to understand them and nuance practice accordingly. And we know that gender norms are made worse by grinding, material poverty, lack of services and infrastructure, lack of job opportunities. And the other brake on change is crisis. And it won't have gone unnoticed, next slide please, that the effect of COVID-19 on women and children has been significant in domestic violence, care responsibilities, job losses, and so on. And we also see this with crises, financial crises. It can undo years of work. Next slide, please. So I just was going to show you this a conceptual framework which shows how your norms change. You have your norm maintenance at the top, and you have these often invisible patriarchal brakes which are just slowing the process down. But you also have these systemic barriers which include poverty, and that a changed norm enhances further change. Next slide, please. So to finish, change happens. We can work both on the mind and alter people's mindsets, as with men and masculinities work. Next slide. We can work with individuals and communities, encouraging people to step out of their normal and act differently. Next slide. And we can also work on the institutions of society and on systemic barriers to change norms, and of course on anticipating crisis. Finally, this is my final couple of slides. We'll be talking a lot about how change happens and the sorts of activities that one undertakes in policy and practice, but I wanted to finish with the resistance and change. This is one woman we interviewed in Uganda. She raised her voice against the patriarchal directions of religious interpretations and had a fatwa issued against her. She was voted the worst woman of the year in a national newspaper, alongside Joseph Kony of the Lord's Resistance Army, who was voted the worst man. But she said she wears this as a badge of honor because it means they're taking her seriously. I'm a threat to their ideologies. If you're rocking the boat, you will be attacked. I would be disappointed if not. Final slide, please. So courage and activism weaves through all the stories we heard, pushing for slow but inevitable change. As one woman commented, she, unlike her mother, was able to stand up for change. I didn't want to be sold. I didn't think it right that my worth was being calculated in cows. I refused to be the object of negotiation. I've created my own culture. So our job is to understand norm change in the whole, recognize how slow it can be, understand the brake effect of patriarchy, and while we may work on one specific aspect, position that within a much wider context and process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Caroline. You did a beautiful job of probably introducing some new concepts to many of us and making sure that we are all on steady ground in terms of understanding social norms. Now we will switch to Katherine Stewart. She leads the Economist Intelligent Unit's public policy and thought leadership teams in London. Katherine has led the Out of the Shadows Index, which measures country-level responses to child sexual abuse and exploitation since its inception. A fun fact about Katherine is that she moved into a house in London just after the start of lockdown, and her furniture was stuck in lockdown as well in Southampton, leaving her dog with more places to sit than herself for some time. So it looks like Katherine is ready, and I will disappear again and let her get started. Thanks so much, Katherine.
Thank you, Carrie, for the introduction. I do have furniture now. I'm very pleased. And thank you, LINEA team, for hosting this event and for the invitation. It is an honor to be part of it and to be speaking with and meeting all of you. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the EIU, we're a little bit of an anomaly in this space. We're the research and analysis arm of the Economist group, which most of you will know for publishing the Economist newspaper. And our public policy and thought leadership team works with stakeholders, so governments, NGOs, multilaterals, and the private sector to move the needle on critical issues facing the world today. Next slide, please. And in 2019, we were fortunate enough to launch the Out of the Shadows Index with the support and collaboration of the World Childhood Foundation, the Oak Foundation, and the Carlson Family Foundation. And that index looks at how stakeholders around the world are responding to the scourge of sexual violence against children. So my goal today is to introduce you to the index, walk through some of the key findings of the program, and explain how the index is being used to prioritize areas of action to end child sexual abuse and exploitation. So the Out of the Shadows Index assesses country responses to sexual violence against children through 4 lenses. The environment in which such abuse takes place, including social norms, gender stereotypes, and attitudes towards law enforcement and security, the legal environment, so the laws a country has passed, the domestic capacity and commitment to actually enforcing these laws, and how the private sector, media, and civil society are participating. The index itself is built from over 130 underlying questions divided up into 34 indicators and 4 major categories. These indicators are intended to provide a framework around which stakeholders can dig into the actions countries are taking to protect children. And I've highlighted many of the issues covered in the index that overlap with the goals of this event, including norms and laws against child sexual exploitation. Next slide, please. So the overarching goal of the index is to develop a high-level best practice framework that allows stakeholders to identify policy, system, and structural gaps in child protection and lay out potential solutions that encourage stakeholders to act together. Ultimately, we aim to build a roadmap that allows the world to track progress towards meeting the SDGs. As a little bit of background, for much of the 20th century, violence against children was not on the global development priority list at all. And though this changed with the adoption of the CRC, the elimination of sexual violence against children did not feature prominently until the UN adopted the SDGs. And now the SDG targets pinpoint ending abuse, exploitation, trafficking, tortured, and all forms of violence against children by 2030. And this effort is being further complemented by the focus that some countries are placing on ending sexual violence against children within their legal frameworks. Next slide, please. So the EIU covers 60 countries with varying levels of development and income in all regions around the world. And these 60 countries cover just under 85% of all children globally, and were chosen to provide both a representative global sample of income levels, regions, commitments to ending child sexual abuse and exploitation, and maximum coverage of children. Next slide, please. So what did we find? If we can push on. To put our findings in the context of Caroline's and Stephanie's presentations, there's a strong relationship between perceptions of sex, sexuality, and gender, and child sexual abuse. And these can shape attitudes to sexual violence against children and how communities respond to it. More broadly, stigma around these issues can create a more secretive environment in which sexual violence is not openly addressed. So within the index, we explore issues including gender equality, attitudes towards premarital attitudes towards those who are LGBTQ, attitudes towards self-selective abortion and adolescent pregnancies, and attitudes toward corporal punishment for children, which could set the stage for norms around sexual abuse of children. And as shown, countries that have more openness towards sex, sexuality, and gender equality are more likely to have strong national responses to child sexual abuse and exploitation. Next slide, please. And perhaps unsurprisingly, it is the lower and low income countries where stigmas are most prevalent, which often prevents people within those countries from addressing issues related to child sexual abuse and exploitation. Next slide, please. However, there are substantial gaps across all countries in protecting children against sexual violence. So only 4 of the 60 countries we examined scored as high as 75 on the index, which roughly means that these countries only received full credit on 3/4 of the 130 questions asked in the index. And although most of these countries are in the top quartile and are high income, there are developing economies like Colombia, Peru, India, and Uganda that have pushed into the upper rankings and are outperforming some research-rich economies. Next slide, please. But overall, the gaps in developing economies are extremely concerning because of the rapid burgeoning of youth populations happening in the developing world, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And this is happening in tandem with increased access to the internet, where the greatest spikes in penetration are also occurring in developing economies. And so for all the developmental benefits, greater connectivity through the internet is also enabling new forms of child sexual abuse and exploitation to emerge as countries go online and upgrade to broadband. And of course, this has been further impacted by the pandemic. So this confluence of rapid broadband penetration, booming youth populations, and then heightened instability and the COVID-19 effects create an urgency to really act upon some of these risks. Next slide, please. So what is it looking like at the country level? For most of these countries, the strongest performance was in the legal framework category. So this means that countries are putting legal mechanisms in place to protect children, but the scores for government capacity and commitment are significantly lower, showing that the implementation of laws and the quality of response is actually lacking. And this is especially true in lower middle income countries, where there's an over 20-point score gap between the legal framework and domestic capacity and commitment categories. So this tells us we need more cohesive action among stakeholders, government, law enforcement, professionals, the private sector, civil society, the media, to move the needle on these issues and to build capacity to actually implement the laws that are in place in countries. Where have we seen progress? In Uganda, East Africa's highest scoring country in the index, resources for legal and law enforcement professionals have been put in place, and the Uganda Directorate of Public Prosecutions and UNICEF have published a handbook to guide and support prosecutors and law enforcement personnel responding to cases of child sexual abuse. Further, the government provides training and guidelines on interacting with victims of child sexual abuse and exploitation to professionals in the education, health, and social work sectors. But support for professionals working with children who have experienced abuse has not yet translated into victim support programs. And then in Tanzania, we've seen unprecedented strides among low-income countries to improve internet protections. So the Cyber Crime Act of 2015 and the Electronic Communications Regulations introduced in 2018 make it mandatory for internet service providers to report any representation of sexual abuse and exploitation. And this puts Tanzania among the top 10 countries in the index on ISP regulation and protection. Next slide, please. So what do we hope the index will do, and what has it already done? Next slide. Our goal is to help stakeholders identify the key issues that need to be addressed by highlighting the gaps in existing systems to protect children. This index is just a first step into the issue, and through diving more deeply into each indicator in question, we hope that governments, the private sector, and civil society will keep taking steps to protect children. One of the key findings is that this issue requires action from all stakeholders working together. There are critical links among government initiatives, private sector ones, and non-governmental organizations that are all putting resources into protecting children, and creating a more directed, holistic action plan will increase that effectiveness. And finally, the SDG targets to seek to end all types of violence against children. And as we continue to build out the index over time, we hope to be able to track progress towards meeting the SDGs. Next slide. We have encouragingly been able to start conversations with governmental organizations around the world, including CONANDA in Brazil, the European Parliament, government leaders in the Middle East, UK, and soon in Asia. And we have been in discussion with government representatives involved with UNICEF, although there's a lot more that needs to be done there. Next slide. We have also been pushing the issue with the private sector, who hold much of the data needed to connect the dots, especially between law enforcement and online platforms, which are so often used to facilitate the production and dissemination of child sexual abuse material online, and that often don't have a comprehensive structure and regulations to protect children. And finally, the index has fed into an Out of the Shadows Index advocacy fund directed at funding organizations who have laid out specific pathways to address the index findings at the local level. And the bulk of these organizations are operating in the developing economies, especially in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa. Next slide, please. So I encourage you to spend some time exploring the website, the white paper, and the country profiles and data, and identifying what you as a researcher, advocate, or civil society leader and as an individual can do to prevent child sexual abuse and exploitation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Katherine. Wonderfully beautiful slides, beautiful content, and under time, which is perfect because I think we are perfectly on time here. So now I'm going to switch to Emily Esplen, who is an advisor on violence against women and girls at the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, which is formerly DFID for those of us who are more familiar there. At DFID, she managed the What Works to Prevent Violence program and designed its successor, and has shepherded through to reality despite the major shift in the location of her office within the UK government. A fun fact about Emily is that her favorite actor is Cillian Murphy. So I'm going to disappear now and turn it over to Emily.
Thanks, Carrie. It's a real pleasure to be part of the conversations today, and I'm very much looking forward to learning from all the fascinating work that everyone's doing in this field. So I've been asked to share my perspective today as a policymaker, a donor, someone who works in and with government, but also really closely with researchers and civil society. And I'm going to talk in particular about the findings from the UK's flagship What Works to Prevent Violence Research and Innovation programme, what we've learned from this and where we might go from here. And I'll touch on some of the questions that we've been grappling with in DFID and now FCDO, and the priorities that I see for the field moving forward from where I'm situated. I do want to first acknowledge, though, that many people in this group have been really fundamental to leading the What Works research. Rachel Dukes was the director of the consortium, Andy Gibbs, Laurie Heisey, Gemma Ferguson, and Carrie as well. And they are far better placed than me to speak to the detail of the studies. Several of them will be presenting over the rest of the week, which is fantastic. So I'm going to keep my remarks quite high level and focus really on some of the implications that I see for policy and practice. And in the discussion, I'd really welcome any further reflections from others that have been so closely involved in this work and who I have learned very much from over the last few years. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So first, some brief background for those who aren't familiar with the What Works programme. This culminated earlier this year after more than 6 years of rigorous research on the prevalent patterns and drivers of violence against women and girls, and most crucially on what works to prevent it, with studies conducted across 16 countries in Africa and Asia, focused primarily on intimate partner violence, to some extent also non-partner sexual violence and violence in schools, and a mix of quantitative and qualitative methods. So one of the most exciting areas of our portfolio for me, and I hope of interest to you today, were 5 evaluations of what we called community activist approaches to change social norms to prevent violence against women and girls. And it's these that I'm going to focus on today. So researchers led by Rachel evaluated 5 approaches from very different contexts in the DRC, Ghana, Rwanda, South Africa and Nepal, a mix of urban and rural settings. But what was common across these approaches was that they all contained some element of community activism, led by trained volunteers or community action teams to diffuse new ideas on gender and violence through communities. So what made these interventions different to the others in the What Works portfolio was that they targeted the wider population, not only those directly involved in an intensive intervention. And this for me was what made these interventions really quite interesting and novel. So just a bit about the interventions. All 5 provided direct training and support to community members to lead social norm change activities, which range from more structured community dialogues to informal discussions, for example, in markets and other places where people meet, including use of role plays, drama, other participatory approaches. And in 2 of the settings, the activism was actually led by a core group of couples who had first been through an intensive participatory training using a couples curriculum. Other elements common to most but not all of the interventions included engaging and equipping religious and community leaders to promote gender equality and non-violence, engaging state actors, particularly security and justice and health providers, and deliberate support to survivors. For those who are interested, the interventions were evaluated with an RCT in Rwanda, South Africa and Nepal. In Ghana, we used a quasi-experimental study with a control group, and in the DRC, a before and after design was conducted with cross-sectional surveys of the community. Next slide, please. So what did we find? The What Works evaluations have shown that social norm change interventions like these can achieve significant reductions in IPV within programme timeframes. And I'm going to give 2 examples. We saw some encouraging results from Ghana, as you can see from this slide, where we evaluated an intervention that supported community action teams to educate and sensitise community members on violence using participatory methods like drama and role plays, as well as supporting survivors to access justice and support. As you can see here, by the end line, we'd seen a 55% reduction in women's experience of sexual intimate partner violence, which was statistically significant, and a 50% reduction in their experience of physical partner violence. Similarly, in Eastern DRC, we had success through an intervention that mobilised and trained faith leaders to be catalysts within their communities to prevent violence, and also trained members of the community as gender champions to engage the wider community through a series of community conversations on gender and violence. In addition, community action groups were set up to provide basic psychosocial support and to help survivors to access medical treatment. And again, the results were really promising here. Women's experience of IPV fell from 69% to 29% by end line. Prevalence of non-partner sexual violence fell from 24% down to 4%. And we saw significant shifts in attitudes, for example, around the acceptability of violence, men's entitlement to sex, and so on. I should add that obviously in the absence of a control group, we need to have some caution in attributing the effects to the intervention. But nonetheless, some really encouraging results. Not surprisingly though, given that these are highly complicated behaviour change interventions, not all of them demonstrated an impact on reducing IPV. So we found that some projects did positively affect precursors to violence, for example, through reduced acceptability of IPV and more supportive community responses to survivors, but they had not translated into reduced violence within the timeframe of the evaluation. We had 2 interventions, as I mentioned, with groups of couples, which combined participatory training using a couples curriculum with community activism, which was led by a subset of the trained couples to share new messages and understanding through their social networks. And here the outcomes for couples were promising, but it was hard to get a diffusion of benefits to the wider population, potentially because of insufficient duration or intensity of the community activism components. And I know that Carrie and Gemma have been doing further research to look at the pathways of diffusion into the wider community. So I really hope we have some time to hear about your insights there. So next slide, please. Before I go on, I just want to briefly reflect on what we now know from this expanding body of evidence, from what works, but also other studies, because it really feels like we're at a moment of opportunity, where I think as a field, we now have rigorous evidence that community activist approaches to change social norms can achieve significant reductions in violence. And actually, this doesn't have to take generations. We've also seen that we can have an impact not only on a particular group exposed to an intervention, but on an entire population, even if this is hard to do well, and I'll come to that. We've seen that this work is cost effective. Research under What Works that will be published shortly found that well-established interventions focusing on norm-changing communities were actually the most cost-effective approaches to prevent VORG across our portfolio. And I think this is a really important finding for engaging policymakers and governments. And certainly in DFID, this evidence has been really powerful in enabling us to make the case for investing in social norm change. And this is really important because there can be quite a profound nervousness or skepticism even around the efficacy of investing in norm change approaches based on a perception that these just don't deliver tangible impacts within programme timeframes. So this kind of evidence that we now have actually really can be a game changer, I think, in showing that norms can and do change, that these approaches work to prevent violence, and that investing in scaling up established community interventions to prevent violence is justified actually from an economic perspective. So I think as a field, we have a huge opportunity, and certainly for DFID or FCDO, a responsibility to be using this evidence to advocate for increased investment in these approaches that we know have potential, when they're done well, to prevent violence against women and girls. At the same time, What Works and other studies too have really underscored how difficult this work is, and how hard it is to do it well. And I've said this before to others, but I think some of our most productive learning really came from reflecting on what hasn't worked in quite the way we'd hoped and why, and how we can use this to refine and strengthen the field. So let me move on to share some of our reflections about what does but also doesn't work. So in the interest of time, next slide please. In the interest of time, I'm going to highlight 4 key elements here. Firstly, our evidence has shown that these interventions require sufficient duration, coverage and intensity to be effective. Not surprising. In our studies, changes in violence were first evident between around 18 to 36 months, which was longer than our exclusively work-based interventions. Not surprising, really, given that the theory of change requires the time for new ideas to diffuse through communities. So in Rwanda, for example, where we adapted the SASA approach from Uganda, our research suggests that the process of behaviour change may have been starting just at the point that the programme ended. So we didn't see reductions in violence. And I think one of the lessons we've taken from this is that we really need to allow a minimum of 3 years to be seeing population level change. I'm sure this isn't surprising to anyone on this call, but it is a really important message, I think, to convey to policymakers. Similarly, our interventions work best when coverage and exposure to project activities was high. So in the DRC, communities were small and it was possible to establish direct contact with about 70% of the population. I mean, of course, this has some challenges for scale up. Secondly, although, as I say, the approach is varied, we did see some common elements across effective interventions. These combined behaviour change communication activities, such as public talks, with opportunities for interpersonal communication, skills building, and changes in thinking through structured participatory approaches that allowed for critical reflection on gender relations and the use of violence. We also have some evidence that interventions are more effective when there's support provided for survivors of violence, helping women to process trauma, making interventions more tangibly beneficial, and sending a clear message that violence is not acceptable. Thirdly, not surprisingly, we found that context was key. In Rwanda, for example, it's possible that the activism component was not very well suited to the very formal nature of Rwandan society, which may have curtailed opportunities for informal engagement and potentially impacted on diffusion and reach in communities. And this was very different to our experience in Ghana, where informal engagement was much more common. On population, I just want to make one point that I found interesting, which is that we have some evidence to suggest that norm change interventions may be less effective for the most violent men whose behaviour may not be influenced by social norms. So in South Africa, for example, our evidence suggests that while the intervention may have had some impact on the less violent, more law-abiding men, it had no impact among the most violent men. So I think it's a really important question then about what works to reach those men. And then lastly, but crucially, having a selected, well-trained and supervised cadre of facilitators or community activists was absolutely critical to the success of a number of What Works projects. Our successful interventions had longer training, so 2 to 3 weeks, and ongoing support, including through manuals and materials. And I think investing in this is going to be really key if we want to prevent violence using norm change approaches. So just last slide, please. I want to end with some reflections briefly on where we go from here. We now have proof of concept for effective small-scale norm change interventions to prevent violence, but quite limited understanding or experience of taking this work to scale. And in DFID, we've been grappling with this question of how to systematically scale up violence prevention approaches, including norm change methodologies that we know hold such potential, while recognising that this is going to be difficult to do well. So this is going to be the focus of a major new investment, 67.5 million over the next 7 years, the successor to What Works, which will be the first global effort to systematically test the scale up of promising violence prevention approaches. Some of the questions that we want to explore include, how do we adapt and scale promising approaches without compromising impact, sustainability or ethics? How do we maintain intensity at scale, knowing that this is key to success? How do we identify, train and support the skilled workforce to lead this work? And how do we take the essential elements and use these to adapt large-scale sector programs to optimize their impact on violence prevention, such as education, social protection, livelihoods, economic development? At the same time, I think it's really important to avoid an over-reliance on the existing but still quite limited evidence base, and on only replicating the most recent so-called tried and tested models. We all know there's many research questions still to answer, and continued investment in innovation, I think, will remain critical for identifying new solutions and honing the solutions that we now have to continue to move the field forward. Just to give a few examples, under What Works, even our most effective interventions still only succeeded in reducing violence by around 50% and often left very high levels of residual violence. So we want to understand what different combinations, intensities or duration of approaches might work to reduce the remaining violence and move us closer to zero. Little is known about the sustainability of our impacts over time. We want to come back and evaluate the most effective interventions from What Works 2 to 3 years down the line to understand whether our impacts endured. Similarly, we're very interested in exploring other urgent challenges, such as how we can be adapting promising or proven interventions from more stable settings to work in situations of crisis or conflict. And indeed, how can we adapt approaches targeting the general population to reach women and girls facing multiple intersecting forms of discrimination? So lastly, we know that success will depend on building political support for violence prevention efforts and investment in norm change approaches, as well as strong capability and capacity to deliver. And certainly on the latter, What Works too, as we're calling it, will have a strong focus on strengthening knowledge and skills for evidence-based prevention, including by supporting governments, donors and civil society to engage with the now expanding body of knowledge in this area and really use this to design policies and programs that work in specific contexts. And I think this is a really important challenge for all of us that are working at the intersection between research, policy and practice in this field. And lastly, I think it's critical that we use the knowledge that we now have to really shore up political support and investment behind effective norm change approaches. The UK has just taken up co-leadership of a new global action coalition on gender-based violence, which is one of 6 being launched to mark 25 years since Beijing, to really accelerate action over the next 5 years. We're certainly committed to using our leadership to try and drive the more concerted, scaled up action and investment in evidence-based approaches. And I know that others are also mobilising behind this too. So I think we're at a very exciting time with this agenda. I look forward to seeing what progress we can make together to really put this evidence base to work and use it to continue to refine the field. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, Emily. Thank you for ending this panel before we get to Q&A on such a bright note, sort of echoing the comments that we are in unprecedented times in terms of what we know what works, and the opportunities to continue to innovate, especially cost-effective ways of reducing various forms of gender-based violence.